The stately mansion on East Battery was quiet that humid August morning, its grand rooms eerily still beneath the weight of the southern heat. The world beyond the iron gates and manicured lawns went on in a whisper. Birds chirped softly, the tides of the nearby harbor ebbed and flowed, and Charleston's elite rose from their beds to start another day. But inside the sprawling home of Charlotte Emery, the air was thick with the scent of decay. It was not until noon that Charlotte's housekeeper discovered her employer's lifeless body, sprawled across the pristine white carpet of the master suite, blood pooling beneath her silver hair. Charlotte Emery, once the radiant and formidable widow of a shipping tycoon, was dead. The investigation that followed would reveal a tangled web of deception, lust, and power, a dangerous affair with Ian Carter, a 22-year-old university student who had entered Charlotte's life months earlier as a charming and ambitious companion. What began as a thrilling, passionate relationship, dripping with secrets and desires, spiraled into manipulation, jealousy, and ultimately a murder that would shake the foundations of Charleston society. This is the story of how the desperate needs of a woman clinging to her past and a man hungry for a future collided in a deadly game neither could win. Charleston, with its cobblestone streets and antebellum mansions, had always been a city steeped in tradition and old money. It was a world Charlotte Emery had been born into, and one she navigated with precision and grace for 75 long years. She had always known her place in society, raised to be both a Southern belle and a power player in an arena dominated by men. Her father was a land baron, and her mother a fierce socialite who taught her daughter the importance of status, control, and appearances. By 19, Charlotte was married to Theodore Emery, a man 20 years her senior, with a vast shipping empire that spanned the Atlantic. The marriage, while devoid of passion, had suited her. Theodore was rich, influential, and absent much of the time. A perfect husband for a woman who had learned early on that power was more valuable than love. She played the role of devoted wife, attending charity galas, hosting opulent dinner parties, and managing their staff with the same precision she used to keep her public image immaculate. To the world, Charlotte Emery was the perfect wife, the epitome of class and grace, but privately, Charlotte was a woman of intense, unfulfilled desires. Theodore's passing in 2005 was expected. He had been sick for years, his robust physique withered by cancer. Charlotte had braced herself for widowhood, and when it finally came, she wore her grief like a crown. The funeral had been a grand affair, attended by politicians, business magnates, and Charleston's wealthiest families. And after the mourners had gone, leaving her alone in the vast mansion that now belonged entirely to her, Charlotte had breathed a sigh of relief. For the first time in her life, Charlotte was free. Free from the constraints of marriage, free from the expectations of a dutiful wife. She was wealthy beyond measure, with more money than she could ever spend and more influence than she had ever wielded. But as the years wore on, Charlotte realized that freedom, like everything else, came with a price. Her days were filled with appointments and meetings, lunches with old friends, board meetings for the charitable foundations she headed, and weekly spa treatments at the exclusive clubs where Charleston's old guard gathered to gossip and commiserate about the changes sweeping through their once sacred circles. But no amount of wealth or influence could stave off the one thing Charlotte feared most: time. She had always been a striking woman, with high cheekbones, piercing green eyes, and the kind of regal bearing that made heads turn when she entered a room. But as the years passed, the once whispers of admiration began to shift to hushed gossip about her age, her fading beauty. And while Charlotte continued to command attention at every event she attended, she felt the eyes of younger women on her, felt their youth and vitality in a way that both infuriated and terrified her. It wasn't enough to have power. She needed to feel desired. She needed to feel alive. This was the secret Charlotte kept from her public life, that behind the carefully crafted facade of elegance and refinement, she was a woman desperate to hold on to her youth. For years she had kept younger men by her side, dashing companions who appeared at her arm at parties, always with a knowing look in their eyes. These men, handpicked for their beauty and discretion, provided Charlotte with the intimacy and attention she craved, but could never publicly acknowledge. Her lovers were fleeting, brief affairs that satisfied her need for control and passion. But none of them had ever touched her heart. None of them had ever mattered. Until Ian Carter. Ian Carter had always been good at reading people. It was a skill he had developed early in life, growing up in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of Charleston, with a mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. His father had left before Ian was old enough to remember him, and the absence of a male role model had forced Ian to mature quickly. He learned to navigate the world with charm and cunning, recognizing early on that the key to success wasn't just intelligence, it was making the right people believe in you. By the time Ian reached university, he had already mastered the art of persuasion. He was tall, athletic, and handsome, with tousled dark hair and a smile that could disarm even the most skeptical of people. His professors liked him. His peers admired him. And women, well, women had always been drawn to Ian. He had a way of making them feel seen, as if they were the only person in the room. It wasn't manipulation, not really, he would tell himself. It was survival. Ian's ambitions far outpaced his circumstances. He wanted more than just a degree in business. He wanted power, influence, wealth, the kind of life he had only glimpsed from a distance while working at upscale events, serving drinks to Charleston's elite. It was during one of these events that he first laid eyes on Charlotte Emery. It was a gala fundraiser for one of Charleston's oldest charities, a night filled with the glittering jewels and tuxedos of the city's upper crust. Ian had been working as a waiter, balancing trays of champagne flutes as he moved through the crowd with practiced ease. He noticed her almost immediately, an older woman seated near the center of the room, her posture regal, her gaze sharp and discerning. There was something magnetic about her. She was older, yes, but there was a power in the way she carried herself, an aura of command that seemed to draw the attention of everyone around her. Ian found himself glancing in her direction more than once, his curiosity piqued by the way she seemed to hold court without saying a word. As the evening wore on, their eyes met across the room, and Ian felt a spark of recognition pass between them. He didn't know what it was, but there was something in her gaze, something that told him she saw him, really saw him, in a way that no one else had. It wasn't long before Ian found himself standing at her table, offering her a glass of champagne. "Young man," her voice was low, almost sultry, and Ian could feel the eyes of the other guests on him as she spoke. "Won't you join me for a moment?" The invitation was unexpected, and Ian hesitated for a split second before accepting. He knew it was a breach of protocol, but something told him that refusing her would be a mistake. And so, he sat down across from her, feeling the weight of her gaze on him as they spoke. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, as if they had known each other for years. Charlotte asked him about his life, his studies, his aspirations, and Ian found himself telling her things he had never shared with anyone. There was something about her presence, something intoxicating, that made him want to impress her, to prove himself worthy of her attention. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers. It was the beginning of a relationship that would change both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. At first, their meetings were casual. Charlotte invited Ian to her mansion for dinner where they would talk late into the night over glasses of vintage wine. She listened intently as Ian spoke of his dreams, his frustrations, his desire to escape the limitations of his upbringing, and in return, she shared stories of her life, stories that were both fascinating and tragic, filled with the weight of a world Ian had never known. It wasn't long before their relationship became something more. The dinners turned into late-night rendezvous, and soon Ian found himself spending more time at Charlotte's mansion than at his own apartment. It was a whirlwind romance, one that Ian never could have imagined. He was living a life he had only dreamed of: luxury cars, designer clothes, dinners at the finest restaurants in Charleston. Charlotte opened doors for him, introducing him to people he would never have had access to on his own. For the first time in his life, Ian felt like he belonged. But there was a darker side to their relationship, one that Ian couldn't ignore. While Charlotte gave him everything he could have ever wanted, she also began to demand more from him. She wanted his time, his attention, his loyalty. The gifts came with unspoken expectations, and Ian soon realized that his newfound lifestyle came at a cost. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, as if they had known each other for years. Charlotte asked him about his life, his studies, his aspirations, and Ian found himself telling her things he had never shared with anyone. There was something about her presence, something intoxicating, that made him want to impress her, to prove himself worthy of her attention. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers. It was the beginning of a relationship that would change both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. At first, their meetings were casual. Charlotte invited Ian to her mansion for dinner, where they would talk late into the night over glasses of vintage wine. She listened intently as Ian spoke of his dreams, his frustrations, his desire to escape the limitations of his upbringing, and in return, she shared stories of her life, stories that were both fascinating and tragic, filled with the weight of a world Ian had never known. It wasn't long before their relationship became something more. The dinners turned into late-night rendezvous, and soon Ian found himself spending more time at Charlotte's mansion than at his own apartment. It was a whirlwind romance, one that Ian never could have imagined. He was living a life he had only dreamed of: luxury cars, designer clothes, dinners at the finest restaurants in Charleston. Charlotte opened doors for him, introducing him to people he would never have had access to on his own. For the first time in his life, Ian felt like he belonged. But there was a darker side to their relationship, one that Ian couldn't ignore. While Charlotte gave him everything he could have ever wanted, she also began to demand more from him. She wanted his time, his attention, his loyalty. The gifts came with unspoken expectations, and Ian soon realized that his newfound lifestyle came at a cost. Worse still, Charlotte's jealousy was growing. She had always been aware of her age, of the gap between her and Ian, but as their relationship deepened, her insecurity became more palpable. Whenever they attended a social function together, she would cling to Ian, her hand on his arm, her sharp eyes scanning the room for any woman who might dare to look in his direction. If he spoke to someone too long, if he laughed a little too freely with a female acquaintance, Charlotte's mood would sour, her eyes would narrow, and later that night, when they were alone, she would grill him about the conversation. "Who was she?" Charlotte would ask, her voice deceptively calm, as she ran her fingers through her silver hair. "I saw the way she looked at you. Does she know about us?" Ian would stammer out reassurances, trying to soothe her, but it was never enough. Nothing ever was. Charlotte had become consumed by her fear of losing him, and Ian, in turn, was being consumed by her. It was around this time that Ian met Sophie Miller, a fellow student at the university. Sophie was everything Charlotte wasn't: young, carefree, with a wide smile and an infectious laugh that drew Ian in like a moth to a flame. She had no idea about his relationship with Charlotte, and Ian was careful to keep it that way. At first, his meetings with Sophie were innocent: study sessions at the library, coffee dates in the campus cafe. But it wasn't long before their connection deepened. Sophie's lightheartedness was a welcome escape from the oppressive weight of his relationship with Charlotte. With Sophie, Ian felt like he could breathe again, like he could be himself without the constant pressure to live up to someone else's expectations. Their affair began slowly, cautiously. Ian would tell Charlotte that he had late-night study sessions, that he needed to focus on his exams. In reality, he was spending those nights with Sophie, losing himself in the warmth of her embrace. It was a dangerous game, one that Ian knew couldn't last, but he couldn't stop himself. He needed Sophie just as much as he needed Charlotte, though for very different reasons. It wasn't long before Charlotte became suspicious. She could sense the distance growing between them, could feel Ian pulling away. He no longer stayed at the mansion as often, no longer returned her texts with the same immediacy. There was someone else occupying his time, and Charlotte's jealousy began to fester. She became more possessive, more controlling. She started calling him multiple times a day, demanding to know where he was, who he was with. She would show up at his apartment unannounced, her eyes sharp and accusatory as she scanned the room for any sign of another woman. Ian could feel the tension building, could feel the storm brewing just beneath the surface. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The breaking point came one humid July evening. Ian was sitting in Charlotte's grand living room, his body tense as he scrolled through his phone. Sophie had sent him a message earlier in the day, something light and flirty about their plans for the weekend, and Ian's heart had skipped a beat when he saw her name flash across the screen. But now, sitting in Charlotte's mansion, he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He was living a double life, and the pressure of it was starting to take its toll. Charlotte was in the next room, finishing a phone call with one of her many social acquaintances, and Ian could feel the weight of her presence even from a distance. She had become increasingly volatile in recent weeks, her jealousy reaching a fever pitch. Every interaction they had was laced with suspicion, and Ian knew that it was only a matter of time before she confronted him. When Charlotte entered the room, her sharp eyes immediately locked onto Ian's phone. She had always been perceptive, always able to read him in ways that made Ian uncomfortable. Tonight was no different. "Who were you texting?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual as she moved across the room to pour herself a glass of wine. Ian stiffened, the lie already forming on his lips. "Just a classmate. We've got a big project coming up." But Charlotte wasn't fooled. She had noticed the way Ian had been acting lately, the furtive glances at his phone, the increased time he spent away from her. And tonight, she wasn't going to let it slide. She crossed the room in a few quick strides, her eyes narrowing as she snatched Ian's phone from his hand. Before he could react, she unlocked the screen and saw the message from Sophie. There was a moment of silence as Charlotte read the message, her fingers tightening around the phone. Then, slowly, she raised her gaze to meet Ian's, her eyes filled with a fury he had never seen before. "Who the hell is Sophie?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Ian's heart pounded in his chest. He had been caught. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The lie was out in the open, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. "It's not what you think," Ian stammered, trying to find the words to diffuse the situation. "She's just a friend, I swear." But Charlotte wasn't listening. She threw the phone onto the couch, her face twisted in anger as she stalked towards him. "Do you think I'm stupid, Ian?" she hissed. "Do you think I don't know what's been going on? You've been avoiding me, lying to me, and now I find out that you've been screwing some little college girl behind my back?" Ian opened his mouth to respond, but Charlotte cut him off, her voice rising with each word. "I gave you everything," she shouted, her hands shaking as she gestured around the room. "This house, the car, the money. I gave you a life you could never have had on your own, and this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with some little whore?" The word stung, and Ian's temper flared in response. He stood up, his fists clenched at his sides as he glared down at her. "This wasn't part of the deal, Charlotte. he snapped, his voice shaking with anger. "You knew from the beginning that this wasn't a real relationship. You can't control me like this." But Charlotte wasn't backing down. She stepped closer to him, her face inches from his as she spoke in a low, venomous tone. "Oh, I control you, Ian. Don't you forget that. Without me, you're nothing. Without me, you go back to that pathetic little life you had before you met me. You think Sophie is going to take care of you? You think she's going to give you everything I've given you?" Ian's heart raced, his mind spinning with the weight of her words. She was right, and they both knew it. He had become dependent on her, and without Charlotte's money, his dreams of success would crumble. But at that moment, standing in the dimly lit mansion, with Charlotte's accusations ringing in his ears, Ian felt something snap inside him. He couldn't take it anymore. The lies, the manipulation, the constant pressure to live up to her expectations. He was trapped in a gilded cage, and the only way out was through confrontation. For the first time, Ian didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care about the money, the gifts, or the life Charlotte had promised him. All he cared about was getting away from her, away from the suffocating grip she had on his life. "You don't own me," Ian said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'm done." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Charlotte's eyes widened in disbelief, her face contorting with a mix of rage and hurt. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the room was palpable, thick like the humid summer air pressing in around them. Then, without warning, Charlotte's hand shot out, slapping Ian hard across the face. The sound echoed through the room, a sharp crack that left Ian's cheek burning. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling from the shock of it all. And then, in a split second, everything changed. The tension that had simmered between Charlotte and Ian for months finally reached its boiling point that night in her mansion. The slap had left Ian's cheek throbbing, a sharp sting that radiated across his face and down into his chest. He stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at Charlotte as if seeing her for the first time. Her hand still hovered in the air, her expression a mixture of shock and fury at what she had just done. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on him. The rich, opulent furnishings, the chandelier glittering overhead, the grand piano in the corner, the expensive art hanging on the walls, all seemed to mock him. This was her world, not his. It had always been her world, and Ian had been a pawn in it, used and discarded when it suited her. He had thought he could control the situation, that he could manipulate Charlotte just as easily as she had manipulated him. But he had been wrong. She had always been in control. Charlotte's voice cut through the silence, sharp and bitter. "I'll ruin you, Ian. You'll never get away from me. You'll never amount to anything without me." Those words echoed in Ian's mind, bouncing around inside his skull like a mantra. Without me. Without me. Without me. Ian's vision blurred, his hands clenching into fists as his anger boiled over. He felt trapped, cornered like a caged animal with no escape. His entire life had been a series of choices made out of necessity, decisions driven by survival, by the desperate need to escape his upbringing and become something more. And here he was, being told that he would never be more, that without Charlotte he was nothing. In that moment, a dark, primal instinct took over, a desperate need to break free, to prove that he could reclaim his life, that he could be someone without her. His mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic blur of rage, fear, and helplessness. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the marble statue on the mantelpiece. It was a small sculpture, but heavy enough to do damage. Without thinking, without hesitation, Ian moved toward it. Charlotte's eyes widened as she realized what was happening, but it was too late. In one swift motion, Ian grabbed the statue and swung it toward her. The impact was immediate, brutal. The sound of marble against bone was sickening, a dull thud that echoed through the room. Charlotte stumbled backward, her hands flying to her head as she let out a choked gasp. Blood trickled down her forehead, staining her silver hair. Ian stood there, breathing heavily, the statue still clutched in his hand. He couldn't believe what he had just done. Charlotte, the woman who had controlled every aspect of his life for the past year, was now crumpled on the floor before him, bleeding and gasping for breath. For a moment Ian felt a rush of satisfaction, a twisted sense of justice. This was it. This was his way out. But the feeling was fleeting, quickly replaced by panic as reality set in. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. Charlotte's body convulsed on the floor, her eyes wide with terror as she struggled to breathe. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the plush white carpet. Ian knew he should do something, call for help, try to stop the bleeding, but he couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of lead, his arms heavy with the weight of what he had just done. Seconds stretched into minutes, the room silent except for the shallow, rasping sounds of Charlotte's labored breathing. And then, with one final gasp, she went still. The mansion, once filled with the sounds of life and opulence, was now eerily quiet. Ian stood over Charlotte's body, his mind numb, his hands still stained with her blood. He had killed her. The realization hit him like a freight train, crashing through the haze of adrenaline and anger that had clouded his mind. He had killed Charlotte Emery, the queen of Charleston society, the woman who had given him everything. And now she was dead because of him. Ian dropped the statue, his heart racing as he stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, to get out, to disappear. But where could he go? How could he possibly escape this? There was blood everywhere, his fingerprints were all over the statue, and his car was parked in the driveway. There was no way out. No way to undo what had just happened. Panic set in, sharp and overwhelming. Ian's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around the room, his mind scrambling for a plan. He had to clean up, he had to get rid of the evidence, he had to cover his tracks. But the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. There was no covering this up. There was no escaping what he had done. Ian moved mechanically, as if on autopilot. He grabbed a towel from the nearby bathroom and tried to wipe the blood from his hands, but the sight of the dark red stains only made him more frantic. He couldn't erase this. He couldn't erase her. He rushed to the front door, pulling it open and stepping out into the night air. The cool breeze hit his face, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. His car was parked in the driveway, the keys still in his pocket. He could get in, drive away, and never look back. But where would he go? How far could he get before the police came looking for him? He glanced back at the mansion, at the grand estate that had once been his golden ticket to a life of luxury and power. Now it was a crime scene, and he was the criminal. There was no turning back. With trembling hands, Ian unlocked his car and slid into the driver's seat. His mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't face the consequences. He had to leave now, before it was too late. The engine roared to life, and Ian gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a lead blanket. As he pulled out of the driveway, the mansion loomed behind him, a dark shadow against the night sky. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't have a plan. All he knew was that he needed to get as far away from this place as possible. But no matter how far he drove, no matter how fast he ran, there was one thing Ian couldn't escape: the knowledge that he had killed Charlotte Emery. The sun was just beginning to rise over Charleston the next morning when the maid arrived at Charlotte Emery's mansion for her daily duties. She was used to the quiet elegance of the estate, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the gentle rustle of the curtains in the breeze. But today, something felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, and as she stepped through the front door, a sense of unease settled over her. The house was too quiet, the usual sounds of life absent. The maid's footsteps echoed on the marble floors as she made her way through the foyer, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings for any sign of Charlotte. She called out for her employer, but there was no response. Her heart began to race as she moved toward the staircase that led to the second floor, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe Charlotte was still asleep. Maybe she had left early for a meeting. But as the maid climbed the stairs and approached the master bedroom, the smell hit her, the metallic tang of blood. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, pushing the door open to reveal the horrific scene inside. Charlotte Emery's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, her head caved in, blood staining the white carpet beneath her. The sight was too much to comprehend, the violence of it too shocking for her mind to process. The maid screamed, her voice piercing the silence of the mansion, before stumbling back out of the room, her shaking hands fumbling for her phone to call the police. Within minutes, the mansion was swarming with detectives, crime scene investigators, and uniformed officers. The news of Charlotte Emery's murder spread quickly, sending shockwaves through Charleston's elite. This was no ordinary crime. This was the death of one of the most powerful and influential women in the city, a woman whose connections reached far beyond the borders of Charleston. Detective Angela Price, one of the lead investigators, arrived at the scene not long after the first responders. A seasoned detective, with a reputation for solving high-profile cases, Price had seen her fair share of violent crimes, but even she was taken aback by the brutality of this one. Charlotte's body was a mess of blood and broken bones, her once regal face barely recognizable. The room itself was pristine, save for the blood splatter and the overturned statue on the floor. It was clear from the beginning that this was not a random burglary gone wrong. This was personal. Price knelt beside the body, her sharp eyes scanning the scene for any clue, any detail that might point them in the direction of the killer. The statue, an ornate piece of marble, lay discarded near Charlotte's head, still smeared with blood. A blunt force weapon used in a fit of rage. The question was, who had the motive to kill Charlotte Emery? The investigation began in earnest, with detectives interviewing the staff, Charlotte's closest friends, and the people who had last seen her alive. It didn't take long for Ian Carter's name to come up. He was a young man, a university student, who had been spending an unusual amount of time at Charlotte's mansion over the past year. Rumors had swirled about the nature of their relationship, whispers of an affair, of Charlotte's obsession with the younger man. The police didn't have enough to go on at first, but Ian was already on their radar. They knew that his connection to Charlotte was worth investigating, especially given the rumors of tension between them in the weeks leading up to her death. When they brought Ian in for questioning, he played the part of the grieving companion, expressing shock and sorrow at Charlotte's death. He denied any involvement, insisting that he hadn't seen her in days and had no idea who could have done such a thing. But Detective Price wasn't convinced. There was something about Ian's demeanor, something too calm, too controlled, that set off alarm bells in her mind. Then came the discovery of the security footage. The mansion's cameras had captured Ian entering the house the night before Charlotte's body was found. There was no footage of him leaving. That, combined with the messages on Ian's phone and the financial records that showed Charlotte had been supporting him for months, painted a picture of a relationship that had turned sour and a man who had everything to lose. The more they dug into Ian's life, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Charlotte had been his benefactor, his ticket to a life of luxury and success. But she had also been controlling, possessive, and unwilling to let him go. It wasn't hard to imagine that Ian, feeling trapped and desperate, had snapped. As the evidence mounted, Ian's calm facade began to crack. He knew the police were closing in, that it was only a matter of time before they had enough to arrest him. And when the detectives finally came for him, he didn't resist. He was led away in handcuffs, his once promising future shattered in an instant. The news of Ian Carter's arrest sent shockwaves through Charleston. The media had a field day with the story, splashing Ian's face across every headline, dubbing him the Charleston Widow Killer. The trial that followed would be one of the most sensational in the city's history, drawing crowds of spectators eager to watch the downfall of a young man who had been given everything, only to throw it all away in a moment of violence. The trial of Ian Carter, charged with the murder of Charlotte Emery, began on a cold December morning, nearly 5 months after her lifeless body had been found in her mansion. By then, the case had become the most talked-about scandal Charleston had seen in decades. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and members of the city's elite, all eager to witness the spectacle unfold. Outside, television vans lined the streets, and reporters jostled for position, eager to deliver the latest updates to a public ravenous for every sordid detail. The media had latched onto the story from the moment Ian was arrested, spinning it into a narrative of power, lust, betrayal, and murder, a true crime saga fit for primetime television. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The jurors sat stiffly, their eyes fixed on the young man who now sat at the defense table, flanked by his lawyers. Ian had aged in the months since his arrest, the boyish charm that had once defined him replaced by a haunted, weary look. His hair was neatly combed, his suit pressed, but there was no hiding the tension in his posture, the dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who had already been defeated, even before the first witness was called to the stand. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Neil Wainwright, had made it clear from the start that they would pursue the harshest penalty possible. Wainwright was known for his tough stance on violent crime, and this case, with its high-profile victim and salacious details, provided the perfect platform for him to showcase his talents. From the moment he rose to deliver his opening statement, it was clear that the prosecution would leave no stone unturned. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Wainwright began, his voice steady and commanding, "what we have here is not just a murder. It is a cold-blooded, premeditated act of violence, committed by a man who saw fit to take the life of a woman who had given him everything. Charlotte Emery was not only a beloved figure in this community, but she was also a mentor and benefactor to this defendant, Ian Carter. And how did he repay her kindness? By brutally beating her to death with a marble statue." Wainwright's words were sharp, calculated, each syllable designed to pierce the emotional defenses of the jury. He painted Ian as a manipulative young man who had exploited Charlotte's generosity, using her wealth and influence to climb the social ladder, only to turn on her when she threatened to take it all away. "The evidence will show," Wainwright continued, "that Ian Carter was financially dependent on Charlotte Emery, and when she began to assert control over him, when she threatened to cut him off, he decided that the only way to maintain his luxurious lifestyle was to eliminate the one person standing in his way." As Wainwright spoke, Ian stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. He had heard these accusations before, had replayed them over and over in his mind during the sleepless nights in his cell. But hearing them in this public setting, with the eyes of the world upon him, made the reality of his situation all the more unbearable. The prosecution's case was built on a solid foundation of evidence: the security footage of Ian entering Charlotte's home the night of the murder, the bloody marble statue found at the scene, and, most damning of all, the messages on Ian's phone that suggested growing tension between him and Charlotte in the weeks leading up to her death. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that the prosecution intended to rely on. Wainwright had lined up a series of witnesses, former friends, colleagues, and even staff members, who would testify to Charlotte's character and the nature of her relationship with Ian. They would paint her as a generous, if somewhat controlling, benefactor who had taken Ian under her wing and given him opportunities he could never have achieved on his own. The defense, led by Cameron Morris, a high-profile attorney known for defending the city's wealthiest residents, had a different narrative to tell. From the beginning, it was clear that Morris intended to frame Ian not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a victim, someone who had been manipulated and controlled by Charlotte, driven to desperation by her obsessive need for control. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morris began, addressing the jury with the practiced ease of a man who had been in courtrooms like this for decades. "This is not a case of premeditated murder. This is a case of a young man who found himself trapped in a toxic, abusive relationship with a woman who wielded her wealth and influence like a weapon. Morris's strategy was clear: to shift the blame onto Charlotte, to paint her as the villain of the story, a wealthy, manipulative woman who had used Ian for her own purposes and then discarded him when he no longer served her needs. He would argue that Ian had been pushed to the brink, that his actions, while tragic, were the result of a psychological breakdown brought on by months of emotional and financial abuse. "Charlotte Emery was not the saint the prosecution would have you believe," Morris continued, his voice softening as he delivered his words with a carefully measured cadence. "She was a woman who craved control, who could not bear the thought of losing the one thing she could no longer buy: youth. And when Ian Carter, a young man with dreams and ambitions, tried to assert his independence, she turned on him. She threatened to destroy him, to take away everything she had given him. Is it any wonder that in that moment of desperation Ian lashed out?" Morris paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. What happened that night was not premeditated. It was a tragic accident, the result of months of psychological pressure and manipulation. Ian Carter is not a murderer. He is a victim. The trial unfolded over the course of several weeks, each day bringing new revelations, new pieces of evidence, and new witnesses to the stand. The prosecution called Detective Angela Price to testify about the crime scene, walking the jury through the grisly details of Charlotte's murder. Price described the blood splatter patterns, the position of Charlotte's body, and the marble statue found near her head, still smeared with Ian's fingerprints. "It was clear from the start," Price testified, "that this was a crime of passion. The amount of force used, the multiple blows to the head, it all pointed to someone who was acting out of intense emotion." Next came the forensic pathologist, who provided the jury with a detailed account of Charlotte's injuries. The blows to her head had been brutal, the result of repeated strikes with a heavy object. The pathologist's testimony was clinical, devoid of emotion, but the effect it had on the jury was unmistakable. The image of Charlotte's broken body, laid out in cold, scientific terms, was hard to shake. But it was the testimony of Sophie Miller, Ian's secret lover, that provided the most dramatic moment of the trial. Sophie had been subpoenaed by the prosecution after they discovered her relationship with Ian through text messages and social media posts. She had initially refused to testify, but under threat of legal action, she reluctantly took the stand. Sophie was a nervous wreck as she sat before the courtroom, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the witness stand. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she recounted the details of her relationship with Ian, how they had met, how their affair had begun, and how Ian had confided in her about his growing frustration with Charlotte. "He said he felt trapped," Sophie testified, her voice quivering with emotion. "He told me that Charlotte wouldn't let him go, that she was controlling his life. He was scared of what she might do if he tried to leave her." Sophie's testimony was a double-edged sword for both the prosecution and the defense. On the one hand, it supported the prosecution's narrative that Ian had been leading a double life, betraying Charlotte behind her back. But on the other hand, it lent credence to the defense's argument that Ian had been under immense psychological pressure, that he had been driven to violence by a woman who refused to let him go. The courtroom was silent as Sophie finished her testimony, her eyes red with tears. Ian couldn't bring himself to look at her. He had dragged her into this mess, and now her life would never be the same. As the trial wore on, the defense presented their own witnesses, psychologists and character witnesses who testified about Ian's mental state in the months leading up to the murder. They described him as a young man who had been pushed to the brink, manipulated by a wealthy woman who used her money and power to control him. The psychologist spoke of the psychological toll that Charlotte's behavior had taken on Ian, painting a picture of a man who had been driven to violence out of fear and desperation. But the prosecution was relentless in their cross-examinations, poking holes in the defense's arguments, pointing out inconsistencies in the timeline, and reminding the jury of the cold, hard evidence, the security footage, the fingerprints, the blood-stained statue. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides delivered their closing arguments. Wainwright, the district attorney, stood before the jury one final time, his voice calm and measured as he laid out his case. Ian Carter had everything to gain from Charlotte Emery's death, Wainwright said. She was about to cut him off financially, and rather than lose the luxurious lifestyle she had given him, he chose to kill her. This was not a crime of passion. This was a calculated, premeditated act of murder. Cameron Morris, the defense attorney, followed with his closing argument, appealing to the jury's sense of empathy. "Imagine being in Ian Carter's shoes," Morris said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "Imagine being a young man with dreams and ambitions, only to find yourself trapped in a relationship with someone who controls every aspect of your life. Ian didn't want to kill Charlotte. He wanted to be free." The jury was sent to deliberate, and for hours the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Reporters outside waited eagerly for the verdict, while inside, Ian sat alone at the defense table, his hands trembling in his lap. His entire life hung in the balance. The jury returned after 3 long days of deliberation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone took their seats, waiting for the decision that would determine Ian Carter's fate. The foreperson of the jury stood, holding the small slip of paper that would either condemn or save him. Ian felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him as the foreperson's voice rang out. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ian Carter, guilty of second-degree murder." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Ian's head dropped, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the verdict. His lawyers placed a reassuring hand on his back, but it did little to ease the devastation that washed over him. Second-degree murder. Not the premeditated, cold-blooded murder the prosecution had been hoping for, but still enough to send Ian to prison for decades. The judge, her face a mask of stoic authority, delivered the sentence swiftly. 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 25 years. The courtroom exploded into a cacophony of whispers, the media already scrambling to get the story out to the public. Ian barely heard the sentence. His mind was a haze of regret, fear, and sorrow. His life, once so full of promise, had been reduced to this, a prison sentence, a future behind bars. As the guards came to lead him away, Ian turned to catch one last glimpse of Sophie, who sat silently in the back of the courtroom, her face pale and drawn. She didn't meet his eyes. As the doors closed behind him, Ian realized that his life, as he had known it, was over. In the years that followed, the case of Ian Carter and Charlotte Emery faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies. But for those who had been involved, the scars remained. Ian spent the first years of his sentence in solitary reflection, replaying the events that had led to Charlotte's death over and over in his mind. He came to terms with the fact that he had let his own ambition and desire for an easy life lead him down a dark path, one that ended in bloodshed and loss. His early years in prison were filled with bitterness and regret, but over time he began to accept the consequences of his actions. Sophie moved away from Charleston shortly after the trial, seeking a fresh start in a new city. She never spoke publicly about the case again, choosing to leave that chapter of her life behind. But she carried the weight of her involvement with her, always wondering if there had been something she could have done to prevent the tragedy. As for Charlotte Emery, her legacy became a footnote in the annals of Charleston's elite history. The mansion that had once been a symbol of her power and influence was sold off, its grand halls left empty, haunted by the memory of the woman who had been its mistress. But for those who had known her, both the woman and the monster, her shadow remained.